Welcome to part 4 of our series on the intriguing relationship between lucid dreaming and the out-of-body experience, otherwise known as OBE. For this series, we interviewed a number of the top experts in the field of consciousness and posed a preset series of questions to each of them, designed to elucidate the relationship among these human experiences. I'm Bob Price, president of the Institute for Neuroscience and Consciousness Studies, a scientific research and education nonprofit organization based in Austin, Texas. Today we'll be conducting a teleconference with Graham Nicholls, an English author and leading practitioner and researcher into the out-of-body experience. Graham experienced OBEs from an early age and went on to develop techniques to initiate them. He's participated in double-blind scientific research, developed novel sound technologies to trigger them, written several highly regarded books, and lectured widely on the subject. He also conducts online coaching for individuals motivated to learn the skills needed. During this presentation, Graham discusses his definition of OBEs, his early OBE experiences, his model of consciousness, outlines distinctions between lucid dreams and OBEs, and describes evidence for veridical and precognitive perception during OBEs. He goes on to discuss some of the scientific research, his holistic approach to developing an OBE mindset, and the possibility for spiritual transformation through OBEs. His presentation is followed by about 20 minutes of Q&A with the live audience. You'll most likely notice that Graham's image on the video is initially frozen, but that issue is resolved within about 3 minutes. We hope you enjoy this fascinating presentation.
I'm going to start off with the definition of what I consider an out-of-body experience to be. I thought I should talk a little bit about maybe the differences between the standard definitions of the idea of an out-of-body experience and some of the ways I approach it. I think for the lecture overall, I'm going to talk a lot from my own personal experience, but also bring in references to other people's experience and to research in the area. But my general definition of an out-of-body experience is an experience of your full sense of self-awareness and perception at a location other than where your physical body is. So it's not just for me a sense of being out of the body, it's also actually your whole sense of self, your whole sense of identity, if you like, being somewhere other than where your physical body is. The reason I make that distinction is because in many ways the physical body is not really that important in many of my experiences. Often I don't see the physical body, and often I'm not really even aware of it. My primary self feels like the self that is traveling. So it's more like a traveling awareness, a traveling sense of self outside of the body. Areas that are often related to the out-of-body experience that may or may not be a part of it are things like sleep paralysis, lucid dreams, and remote viewing. I'll go into a bit more depth as we go through the talk on how I see the relationships with those. But I think if an out-of-body experience does originate through a lucid dream, for example, I feel that it's probably contains still some of the elements of the lucid dreaming state. So it's somehow almost like a crossover between a lucid dream and an out-of-body experience. And the sleep paralysis experiences in my research tend to be more subjective and more hallucinatory. I don't personally have sleep paralysis, and I should also mention that I don't have my out-of-body experiences from a sleep state. So this is also where I'm sort of exploring the idea between an out-of-body experience and a lucid dream. Okay, so my very, very first out-of-body experiences were spontaneous, but they basically were a feeling of being out of body, floating a few feet above the ground in a vertical position, so very different to the classic idea of coming out of the body and looking down at yourself. In my first out of body experiences, I didn't see my body, and I just found myself at a remote location. So those initial experiences inspired me to learn a little bit more about what was going on. And I think around a year later, after my first experiences as a 12-year-old, I heard the term out-of-body experience. So then I started to explore more about the subject, and I eventually got this book, Out-of-Body Experiences, a handbook by Janet Lee Mitchell, which again comes from a more scientific perspective. So it didn't really have much in the way of techniques in the book. It was more just looking at data, referencing remote viewing, looking at the research around Ingo Swann and people like that, if you're familiar with him. So what I found was just one basic technique towards the back of the book, which was basically an idea of imagining yourself floating on a cloud, essentially. And so I thought, I'll try this technique and see how it goes. So I spent the next 6 months in a very disciplined way, literally every single night, going through this process. Nothing really had happened during that period. I thought it would happen in maybe a week or two, but it actually turned out to be 6 months before I finally had my experience, my first induced experience. And it was interesting because it was almost the point that I'd given up. I was almost going to stop the practice, essentially, because I felt like I wasn't getting anywhere. I'm sure many people who've tried to learn this kind of experience have felt that at certain points. I was at the point of giving up, and I think because of that, I kind of let go. I relaxed into the process, and as I was doing this technique of imagining I was floating, I relaxed into it. I went into a kind of vibrational, early stages of a vibrational state, not a very defined one. And then I had a surge of energy that seemed to just rush through my body, and I found myself floating maybe 2 feet or so from the ceiling, looking straight down at my body with a kind of bluish, greenish light that seemed to be emanating from my body. And I stayed there for a few moments, and then I came back to my body. So it was a very brief experience, but it seemed to open the floodgates. And then after that, I really found that I could have experiences much more consistently. And I started to learn to move around my home, which even that was a process of months of slowly developing, slowly moving around my bedroom and then around the apartment that I grew up in. And then eventually, through quite an intense effort, I was able to move out of the window of the apartment. It was a 20-story, we call them tower blocks in England, but an apartment block basically. And I came out of the window and floated down over the roof of a building opposite, and that was the first time I was able to actually leave the house that I was in. And then I slowly over time developed and was able to go further. Then I started to have experiences that gave me a profound sense of the environment around England and my immediate environment. One of the first experiences that had quite a profound effect on me was an experience of going over the New Forest, which is a very forested area of the south of England. And I moved over the treetops in this particular experience. I'd been at the New Forest during the day, so it was kind of like I'd created a mental link to that location. So then when I returned home, I was drawn back to it almost, and I found myself floating over the treetops. Then I went down into a clearing, somewhat like the image, and then I looked at a flower, and as I looked at the flower, I felt my awareness go into the flower, and it was almost like I was seeing the life force and the energy connected with that plant. It's almost like the sustenance moving up and down the stem. So it was a very powerful and beautiful experience. And these were the experiences that started to make me maybe look beyond just the moving around and just the sort of standard things that I'd begun with a few months earlier. Other experiences that are particularly profound for me are, for example, this experience I had back in 2008, where I was basically in the upper atmosphere of the Earth. The image here is almost exactly as it looked for me. The angle is correct, and the bluish mist that you can see in the top of the image was almost exactly the level that I was at in that particular experience. And I felt myself floating there, and I was completely. I've always been very drawn to space and the idea of leaving the planet and things like that. So I think I was very drawn to that, and some of my more interesting experiences have been related to that. So another experience I had fairly recently in 2012, I found myself moving over what seemed like the lunar landscape, our local moon. But I noticed that there was a different quality to it. If you look at the image up on the left, the quality of the surface looks much smoother than a lot of the images that you see of our local moon, and that's how it appeared within this particular outer body experience. Again, I didn't have a sense of leaving the body or even of or seeing my body or anything like that. It was almost like what some people describe as phasing, where I just found myself moving over this landscape. But then a very interesting thing happened, because I found myself crossing a ridge-like structure on this moon, which you can see in the bottom left image. And I didn't know of any moon that had this very distinctive characteristic. And then, as you can see in the final image, there was also a discoloration to one side of the moon. So essentially, after the outer body experience, I had a very definite sense of what this moon looked like, and that it was very distinctive, so that maybe I would be able to research it or find out what this particular planet was like, or moon was like. So afterwards I was able to find that it actually conformed very, very closely with the third largest moon of Saturn. So these are images of that moon, and this isn't something that I can say is a definite veridical experience or objective experience, but it's one that gives an idea of how sometimes the experiences can be suggestive of being factually accurate, and at other times they can be definitely very factually accurate, which I'll go into more now. Okay, within the questions that Bob put forward, there was this idea of a particular model of the outer body experience and of consciousness, and how I view the whole process and how it might relate to lucid dreaming, and also to the wider issues around consciousness. My particular take on the outer body experience is I don't know whether anything is actually leaving the body or not. My angle is to look at the experience as much as possible, to learn what we can from the experience, and look at the actual data from research, from my own research. I try to do a lot of research by recording my own experiences, by monitoring my own brain states, by doing different research in that kind of area to see if there's anything that suggests what might be going on with the outer body experience. So some of you might be familiar with the idea that's popular within the near-death experience literature of the brain being some kind of receiver. So either there's the filter model that says that you're either filtering consciousness and the brain is acts as a kind of receiver for that filtering effect of the consciousness, or that consciousness is external, possibly in a field, as Rupert Sheldrake relates, for example, and that information is then again translated by the brain. I started to think that possibly the brain is creating some kind of model based on data that's coming from some other area. So the brain is maybe constructing our sense of being in the outer body experience via the information that comes into it. So rather than a television model or a radio model or a filter, it would be more analogous to something like a computer connected to a network. So in that sense, consciousness would be both inside the brain, so i.e. inside the computer, and it would also be outside the internet. You have the information that you put into the computer, it's an interactive process. There's both data in the computer and outside of it. And I think possibly consciousness or human awareness could be something along those lines. But I also keep an open mind, and I also always remember that we don't have all of the information, and I think it's very important to be aware that we don't know everything, and that we're probably wrong about many things. So my angle is, I don't have a very fixed, solid, set model, but this is the one that makes the most sense to me, that the idea that it's almost like an interconnection or a part of a larger network. It also works very well with ideas like those put forward by Tom Campbell, who was mentioned earlier, and also Brian Josephson has ideas like the biological utilization of quantum non-locality theory, which is basically that a biological system uses quantum non-locality, and then also the orchestrated objective reduction theory of Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff, which also talks about something similar, that the brain, the microtubules, the low-level structures of cells could be interconnected with a larger system of consciousness. So this is kind of the framework that I think most relates to our current understandings in science, and the actual phenomena that people like myself experience within the out-of-body experience. Okay, so I wanted to go through, I've put together 17 basic points that for me demonstrate the difference between a lucid dream and an out-of-body experience. Some of these points are very much focused on my particular experiences, and other people's experiences might be closer to a lucid dream state, or there might be a form of out-of-body experience that encompasses the lucid dream, as I mentioned earlier. Maybe there is a kind of crossover experience. I think many of these things are on a continuum, and there's different levels and degrees of depth within the different states that people experience. So I think that's quite possible too. But for this breakdown, I'm going to focus mainly on how my experiences are and how they differ from dream states. Okay, so the first one is a very clear and obvious one, that my out-of-body experiences don't occur during sleep. I am in a state something akin to meditation when my out-of-body experiences usually happen. I lay down, spend a bit of time tuning and going into a very, very light trance state. But I remain conscious to some degree throughout the process. I don't go into sleep. Ways that I've observed that is by looking at my EEG tracings during some of my experiences. I stay in something related to an alpha state, so a very light level of relaxation, but the peaks suggest a higher level of activity. So it's something different to alpha state, but also very distinct from a dream state. Also, the type of awareness, the type of breathing that I have is also not characteristic of sleep. It's more like a sort of meditation or a focused breathing. So things like that would be suggestive that I'm not asleep, but instead I'm in some kind of trance state. Something maybe akin to even a mediumistic trance. As I mentioned, REM is not present while the OBE is taking place. So basically, when I've been observed having an out-of-body experience, no one has ever seen any form of REM, which stands for rapid eye movement, if people are not familiar. And rapid eye movement is one of the signs that someone's dreaming. It's not always present, but it's a common one. And in D. Scott Rogo's research, he also found that REM wasn't present in the subjects that he looked at. Sensory awareness is heightened, more vivid in my out-of-body experiences than anything I've had within a dream state. I'm not a particularly natural lucid dreamer, so this again might be quite specific to me, but there's definitely specific qualities to the out-of-body experience and the stability of the experience that's quite different to something in a lucid dream. I'll get to that in the final point, which kind of looks a bit more at the idea of stability in the dreams. My perceptions are highly veridical in many cases, which I'll give some examples and talk about that as well shortly. So my out-of-body experiences do generally conform to consensus reality, unless I'm actually in a kind of environment that is sort of like on another level, or a more subjective level, which is very hard to say whether that's an objective level or whether it's a purely subjective level. My experiences often involve floating, passing through objects, and time can be non-linear, but other than that, the laws of nature seem to be fairly consistent with consensus reality, unlike in my dreams where anything really could happen, and things that would break the normal laws of physics. My out-of-body experiences also often include a strong sense of memory, a higher degree of memory than would be apparent even in a physical experience. This seems to be quite distinct from dreams. I'm sure everyone's experienced that it can be hard to remember your dreams when you wake up. There's a sort of window of opportunity in which we can record the dreams quite accurately, but beyond that, it becomes quite difficult. So that's also been confirmed by Robert Wagner, who's a friend and expert on lucid dreaming. I'm sure some of you are familiar with him. He's also stated to me that the longer his lucid dreams continue, the less likely it is that he'll remember the details. So memory seems to also be a distinguishing factor. My dreams don't contain, my out-of-body experiences don't contain psychological elements. So what I mean by that is things from my day-to-day life. Sometimes when I go to sleep, if I've been working on a particular subject during the day or I've been doing a particular activity, that might resurface in my dream state. That's never happened in my out-of-body experiences. So there's not this sense of reworking things that I've been doing during the day, and definitely not any sort of interaction with the environment in that sense. For example, talking to people that I was talking to during the day, things like that never happened in my out-of-body experiences. The energy or wave sensations, what's generally referred to as the vibrational state, I like to refer to them as energy sensations because I think actually when I was doing research for my second book, Navigating the Out-of-Body Experience, I spoke to a lot of different people about what they encounter before they have an out-of-body experience. And it seems that there's quite a wide range of sensations, everything from what I experience, which is more of a subtle wave-like sensation, a very mellow feeling, right through to a lecture I gave recently. A woman described it as a freight train. It felt like a freight train was going through the room. So it seems like there's a very broad range of types of experiences, and then also a certain amount of people have what I've come to call the void state, which is more of a womb-like, not unpleasant, but just being in a sort of dark space with no distinctive features and nothing visual about the experience. And then after a period of time, they'll start to move up into another state of awareness or into an out-of-body experience. So it seems like there's a range of states that happen before the out-of-body experience that seems distinctive to sleep paralysis and some of the dreaming states. I can't be totally sure of that, but from what I've looked at, the types of buzzing and different sensations that people describe with sleep paralysis seem to be slightly different to the OBE. But that's, like I say, it's not as certain. But I think it's interesting that no one has really gone into a lot of depth and really described in detail as much as we can the differences between these types of states. I think it sort of highlights that we have a tendency to put things together rather than to try and find if there are distinctive qualities to these different states of being. Another characteristic would be a feeling of release from the after the out-of-body experience. It can be a very very calming, vitalizing experience as it happens, and then afterwards I can often feel much more energized, a real sense of well-being. It's hard to describe, but I often find that this sense of well-being, almost like a feeling of light or energy, something akin to a kind of healing modality, will often be with me for several days afterwards. And as people classically describe in near-death experiences, the idea of that you're very sure that this is something beyond anything else that you've experienced. Again, that's a very subjective definition, but I can definitely say that the out-of-body experiences, the peak out-of-body experiences, not maybe the very mundane or average out-of-body experiences, but the really powerful ones, really have a sense of they were a form of reality that I can't compare to anything I have in other scenarios. Interactions with characters, by which I mean sort of a real narrative to the out-of-body experience, a sense of that you're within a story, that lots and lots of different forms of interaction are taking place. That doesn't seem to be something that happens within my out-of-body experiences, other than the occasional presence of something akin to a guide, which again would be consistent with near-death experiences, and, for example, some of Robert Monroe's descriptions, although I think again it's still slightly different to what Robert Monroe described as well. But guides seem to be something that's consistent across cultures in different kinds of experiences. Again, whatever they are, I don't claim to know, but they whether they're a part of myself or whether they're part of something more complex, that's very hard to say. But there's something that seems to be apparent in some people's experiences. Some research like that undertaken by D. Scott Rogo again suggests that the brain state in OBEs is different to lucid dreaming. Again, he found various different states in his research. I've also heard something similar from Michael Persinger, although he hasn't gone specifically into the out-of-body area of research, there seems to be very distinct brain activity. And in my own research as well, it seems that there isn't a particular form of brain wave or a particular area of the brain that is active within the out-of-body experience. It seems to be in different research there is that different parts of the brain are identified, which suggests to me that rather than it being about one particular brain state or one particular brain area, it's more that the brain is extended, or that the brain is reacting to that information that's coming into it, as I mentioned in my network model. If data were coming into the brain via some other avenue, then possibly the brain would react as if it was physically walking around or physically doing these things, which I know when Ingo Swann's brain was monitored, that similar things were found. For example, unusual electrical activity over his occipital parietal junction, which would suggest that he was experiencing movement or interaction in a space of some form, which again is interesting, I think, in terms of what might be going on and how consciousness and the brain might be functioning. I'll get into that a little bit more to flesh out why I think it might be the brain reacting in this way a bit later on, when I talk about some of the visual components of the out-of-body experience, because they've got some interesting elements that are suggestive that the brain is doing something in terms of data and what's coming into it. The next point would be the physical body is often visible in out-of-body experiences, i.e. you see yourself. That rarely, if ever, happens in my dreams, and I think it's quite rare in other people's dreams as well. Apparitions would be another key aspect. Sometimes people will describe actually seeing me or feeling that they've seen me or someone else during an out-of-body experience, often in the form of a shadow, or sometimes some kind of energy. There's often seems to be some association with a greenish coloured energy that seems to be related to something to do with a projection of consciousness or projection out of the body. And there's also some reports where the person will see an apparition of the out-of-body experiencer in the form of them wearing clothes, looking fully as they would normally in a physical sense, which I'm not aware of many instances of those kinds of things being associated with lucid dreaming. Another interesting factor, this hasn't been looked into in a lot of depth as far as I'm aware, but the idea that after near-death experiences especially, but I've also experienced something that seemed to relate to this, is that people will experience affecting electrical items, pieces of electrical equipment, recorders, lights, things of that nature. Dr. Penny Sartori, who did the largest UK-based near-death experience research, really excellent research actually, hasn't had as much publicity as even the AWARE study that many of you might have heard of, but actually I think Penny Sartori's research was much more interesting than the AWARE study, so well worth looking into if you haven't come across it. But Penny found that many of the near-death experiences that she's dealt with have experienced these strange electrical phenomena after their near-death experience. So this seems another thing that is rarely reported in relation to lucid dreams. Out-of-body experiences occur with no discernible brain activity. I think that's quite a powerful one. So obviously within the near-death experience, when the brain is flatlined, people are still having an out-of-body experience, yet there's no way to correlate that with a kind of dreaming state that of any type that we'd be normally familiar with. So then the final point would be the reality check test, which is the cornerstone really of lucid dreaming. Is the way that you become conscious in a lucid dream is to actually use something like a reality test. The classic one is looking at your own hands, and then flipping them over, flipping them back again. And what tends to happen is there's a breakdown of, as Charlie Morley, the lucid dream author, wrote, a kind of breakdown of the rendering, almost in a sort of computer sense, that your hands will start to shift or change. I've looked at my hands during out-of-body experiences and nothing has happened at all. They've just remained constant, which again suggests a different brain state, or that something else completely is taking place. The breaking down of the visual perception can also happen with text. As I mentioned here, Stephen LeBurge, his research showed that in some cases 95% of text will break down on the second viewing in a lucid dream, whereas in my out-of-body experiences, although text is often difficult to see because focus and clarity can be difficult, it can still be viewed and will not break down if you look at it multiple times, etc. So that's another quite key one, I think, which is it demonstrates there's a different brain state, but it also demonstrates that there's a distinct difference between the experiential level of dreams and OBEs. So I think that gives quite a good foundation for the distinctions and why I feel that my out-of-body experiences are quite distinct. It's one of those things that's it's a very difficult thing to articulate because we're dealing with something that's very subjective. It's like trying to describe to someone what blue looks like if they've never seen blue. But at the same time, I think by putting it in this kind of structure, I think it becomes clear that there are distinctions between the two states. Okay, so I wanted to talk now about some of my verified experiences. The most powerful of all of my verified experiences took place in Soho in London. I'll go through the story. It basically began in a workshop. So this is a really unique experience because I was in a room with 5 other people who I was, or 5 people together, 4 other people. So I was describing this process of inducing an out-of-body experience using the G technique, which is one of the main techniques that I use and I developed, which uses sort of muscle tension and a breathing process. So there's actually a few variations of it, but it's quite an intense process that I use to get myself closer to the vibrational state. So I was teaching this method for the first time to a small group of friends, basically, and I found myself going into an intense out-of-body experience. I went down to the ground level. I felt myself moving through a natural environment initially, and then that natural environment that seemed to have sort of trees and plants, almost tropical, it seemed to break, and I found myself standing on the corner of Moore Street, which I don't know if you can see my cursor, but Moore Street and Old Compton Street, so the V that juts out, there's a point, and I was standing right at that point, looking down the street. And as I stood there rooted to that spot, the whole scene seemed bluish grey. And I stood there looking down the street, and then suddenly there was an explosion burst out from the right-hand side of the street. And a man came running close by to the right-hand side of me. And then chaos seemed to ensue. smoke and general chaos. And then this kind of wave, I couldn't see it, but I felt this sort of wave of energy seemed to hit me. It felt like the emotion from the people who'd been hurt and killed in the bombing hit me, and it sort of took me out of the out-of-body experience. And I came back into the room of the workshop, but I went into something akin to the void state, which I mentioned earlier, that sort of womb-like state. I wasn't able to just come back to normal consciousness straight away. The other people in the room had already become aware that something unusual was happening with me, and so especially one of them, a man called Chris, was trying to coax me back into normal awareness, which he eventually did by just sort of bringing me gradually out of the trance state that I was in. I then went into the middle of the room, and we had a circle, and I described what I'd seen in this out-of-body experience, and that I also felt from it that it was precognitive, which was also an interesting factor about this experience, because I'd never had a precognitive experience before. I didn't even particularly believe that such a thing was possible. I still struggle with the idea, to be honest. And I do look for alternative possibilities, and there are some, such as a complex form of telepathy or something with the person who perpetrated the bombing, something along those lines. There are other ways of viewing what took place, but it definitely felt precognitive to me at the time. And then 5 days after this out-of-body experience, there was a bombing that took place on that exact street, in the exact place that I'd seen in the out-of-body experience. So obviously this was really powerful and significant to me, because I didn't know how to take this or how to look at it. So this is probably, in terms of the intensity of the experience and in terms of the accuracy and the whole factor of that there were witnesses there when it happened, was really powerful. So these are two of the people who were there on the day, just sort of quotes of what they remembered and what they wrote down. The details about the experience were written down within an hour or two of the actual event. So it was very well documented. We all kept diaries, etc., of what happened. Okay, so a more recent and more, I wanted to give an example of something that was a more mundane type of experience, but also one that was confirmed and veridical. This is an image of Tallinn, where I live, in Estonia, and I live within this medieval old town. And in this particular experience, I did have the full exiting of the body experience. I felt myself lifting out of the body. Then I felt myself moving towards the roof, the ceiling. My bedroom is in an attic with kind of sloping walls, and I felt myself go through the attic, through the ceiling, and out into the air, over the cobbled street. Many of the streets in the old town of Tallinn are cobbled, and I moved over the sort of rooftops, as you can kind of see in this image, and I found myself near the Alexander Nevsky Cathedral, which is, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but it's the one with the kind of Russian-looking Orthodox look right in the middle of the screen at the back. So I went over the top of that building and down over the other side, and the whole scene was fairly what I would have expected, what I would would expect to see in the city. There was nothing really distinctive that I could pick out about the environment. But then when I went down over the back of the cathedral, I suddenly saw that there was tarpaulin and there was damage. They'd basically been doing there'd been damage and repairs going on to the back of the window next to the entrance. So I was basically, this was a piece of information that would be different and distinctive to a normal average day of going to the cathedral. So because of this damage, I was able to come back and say, okay, I can take that information down and I can go and verify that. So I wrote down all of the details, and then I was able to go back a little while later, and I found that the damage and the way that they'd covered the broken windows with tarpaulin, as you can see here, was confirmed. So this is a more everyday, more kind of mundane example, but it's something that, again, I even described the color of the tape being yellow, etc. So all of the details of the damage, etc., were correct, and I didn't leave any elements out. So this is my partner Trine's comments about my description, because I also told her all of the details of what I'd seen, and we wrote it all down. So she confirmed the details of what I'd seen as well. Okay, so the probably the most accurate and interesting in terms of small details within an out-of-body experience that I've had was one where I found myself, this time I didn't have any sense of leaving the body. This was just finding myself at a distance. I was near to Marble Arch. If anyone's been to London or knows the area of London, there's a big monument called Marble Arch, which literally looks like a marble arch. And I was on the corner near that arch, and then I was going along the edge of Hyde Park, one of the large parks in the centre of London. And I followed along the edge of that park, and then I veered off across London and found myself in Lancaster Road, which is near to Portobello Road, the famous market in London. And I floated straight across the road and went straight into the upper floor of a terraced house on this road. And as I did, I found myself in a room that looked like an office. It was all laid out with letterheads, paperwork. It was very, very much like you would expect in an office environment. And I looked down at the desk, and I saw the letterhead, and my vision seemed to zoom right into the letterhead and onto the name. I'll talk about this zooming effect more, because this is something that I've noticed, again, is a distinctive factor of how vision seems to work within the out-of-body experience. But as my vision zoomed in, I could see the name of the person who lived there, which I was able to memorize. And then I'd also, as I was coming in, you can see the W11 on the image on the side. The W11 is the signs all over London give you the postcode. It stands for West 11, so that's the area of London. So I'd also, my vision had zoomed right into the 11 on the sign as well. But interestingly, the name of the street I hadn't really seen. I just zoomed right in, and the same with the letterhead. I'd zoomed right into his name, but not to the rest of the details. So it was like my vision was sort of zooming right in. I could even see the grain on the paper, but I couldn't see maybe some of the other details that you would with normal physical vision if you had perspective. So I think it's a quality of out-of-body vision. I think that we probably see in a very different way, because if you think about it, it's very unlikely that we have eyes with retinas that are receiving photons and translating them into some kind of image within the brain. There must be some other process that's going on. So this was one of the first clues that started to give me that idea that maybe there's some kind of reconstruction of vision going on rather than actually vision. So this isn't one of my experiences, but Esteban Monti was one of my students, and while we were working together and I was teaching him to have out-of-body experiences, he took the unusual angle to actually involve his whole family in his learning process. So his brother, his children, everyone was involved in the process of him learning to have out-of-body experiences. During one of his out-of-body experiences, he moved into the kitchen of his home, and while he was in the kitchen, a small shadow figure, which again is a very common description that people give, a small shadow figure moved into the kitchen as well, which he initially didn't know what this shadowy figure was, but then when he moved close to the figure, he realized that it was actually his 8-year-old son, who was having his very first out-of-body experience. So it's quite an amazing first out-of-body experience. I think he's going to be a future author. But you can see the image on the left is some text and a drawing that the boy did about his own first out-of-body experience, and how he met his father. But interestingly, he also didn't see his father as looking like his father. He saw a shadow figure as well. So it was interesting. They both saw a shadow figure, but they were able to meet. And this experience was also independently verified by Esteban's wife, who is actually a psychiatrist, so is quite skeptical about these kinds of things. But she was very blown away by this description and what took place. So I think that's an interesting experience in terms of meeting whilst out of body, and also the whole thing of how we perceive each other while in an out of body experience. Okay, so I wanted to talk a bit about the visual elements of the out of body experience. So, as I mentioned before, when I had the experience in Soho, I was seeing everything in this kind of bluish grey. It was like everything was filtered in some way. And this bluish grey filter has only happened 3 times. One was the experience I just described of going to the office of the man in Lancaster Road in London. And the other is in Soho, this precognitive experience. And the final one was also a precognitive experience of the 7/7 bombing, which was similar to this one, but unfortunately I wasn't able to have witnesses and verification with that experience. But what I started to discover was that these filters, these colours to the experiences seem to have particular qualities, and I found that some experiences had particular elements to them, like the second filter I call the crystalline state. So the first one I call the cerulean state, or the second filter. The first filter would actually be this kind of dark, not very colourful state that people often describe in the early stages of their out-of-body experience. So that would be the sort of first filter, or the first type of visual awareness that people have. Then this second one is very rare. This one is probably one of the more common ones. The experience I described where I saw the tarpaulin and the damage to the church, I was seeing in this kind of crystalline state. So during that experience, I was much more aware that I would be able to see accurately. So that was why I particularly tried to get some veridical verification of that experience. So this state is characterized by greens and yellows. So it's almost like my vision is sort of broken up into two bands of color. So another state that I sometimes have, this isn't very common but was more common early on in my experiences, I would see in reds and oranges. So the nearest I could compare it to would be something like heat signatures. When you see these representations of heat and cold in an environment, the vision looked very much like that. So what I started to realize was that, especially I started thinking about the cerulean vision, the bluish grey vision that I described in the Soho experience. And I started to realize that it's almost like the colors that are described in low light vision, for example, scotopic vision. Scotopic vision is basically how your vision operates when you're in a dark environment. So I started to imagine, I wonder if the brain could actually be translating this psychic information into a form that would make sense. So if that information was coming into the brain, maybe the brain would think that this is somehow low light information, or maybe vision would break down this information into some visual structure, and then you would have these different electromagnetic areas of the visible light spectrum. So as you can see, when I put all of the different qualities, all the different types of vision that I've experienced over the years in my out-of-body experiences, it correlates very well with the bands of the electromagnetic light spectrum, almost exactly, essentially. So that seemed quite interesting to me, that my vision would essentially break down into areas of the electromagnetic light spectrum. And the only one, if you could call maybe filter 5, if you like, or the other one that's not listed here, would basically be to have vision as we see physically. So it would be the full visible light spectrum. So this also started me thinking about how over time I've definitely had a sense that sleep patterns are also quite key in the out-of-body experience, that the melatonin, the darkness, that basically your chronotype, whether you're a morning person or a nighttime person, things like that seem to be quite key in how people get into the out-of-body experiences and how effective they are at perceiving, seeing, moving around, making the experience last longer. All of those kinds of factors seems to be to do with levels of depth of the experience, which seems to be related to the right type of approach, depending on whether you're more of the morning person or the nighttime person. So I've often used goggles or sleep masks or things like that to create a total darkness, because when you have that total darkness, then melatonin starts to be released, which is also interesting because melatonin has an association with the pineal gland, which has long been thought to have a connection with psychic abilities, out-of-body experiences. Anthony Peake and some of my sort of colleagues and different thinkers have talked about the idea that maybe the pineal gland produces DMT, and there's been lots of suggestions that DMT, which stands for dimethyltryptamine, might actually be related to the near-death experience. I'm not totally convinced by that at this point, and I think the evidence for the pineal gland producing DMT is quite weak. But whether that's true or not, the pineal gland and melatonin is quite well established, and I think melatonin probably has an effect on the out-of-body experience. So I think this is all suggestive to me that if we look into these kinds of ideas about how vision might work within an out-of-body experience, we might start to get more of an understanding about how we can develop the ability or possibly improve research that will give us a greater understanding of how to get veridical information and how to prove the experiences are real. So as I was mentioning earlier, this idea of the Zoom effect, I also started to realize that in my experiences, the most common thing I will perceive is a small object or a small area of around 10-inch square diameter. And then I started to realize that in cases across the near-death experience literature and out-of-body experience literature, small three-dimensional objects are the most commonly described things seen during the out-of-body experience that are then later verified. So there's the famous case of the blue tennis shoe that was on a window ledge in the hospital, very widely reported. Pim van Lommel, the largest ever near-death experience research. The most startling case in that research was of a 44-year-old man whose basically his dentures were removed during his cardiac arrest, and he perceived the whole thing while out of body. So again, a small three-dimensional object. And then the very famous case of Pan Reynolds, who saw a surgical drill used on her skull, and the drill looks just like in this. Actually, that is the exact drill as far as I was able to find out. So again, it's within that small three-dimensional object parameter. So it seems to me that this zooming or focused effect, where you go in very close to an object or a piece of text or something like that, seems to be very key within out-of-body vision. And I think that if we think about things like the AWARE study that was recently released, they were using things like a newspaper cutting or something like that as a target for people to perceive within the out-of-body experience. I think that targets that took this kind of information into account might possibly have more chance of being successful, especially if the types of process that people who have out-of-body experiences go through, if that was described, I think that the researchers would probably design much better protocols for doing research. So my own research, my own sort of journey to sort of understand a lot more of this kind of thing led me to work with Rupert Sheldrake, who I've worked with on several projects now, one of which was telephone telepathy trials. The reason this man is in this quite sort of dungeon-like looking environment is because we basically wanted to put him in an environment where there was no magnetic frequencies, where you couldn't use a mobile phone. There was no reception down there. There was no real sound. It was very isolated. So all in all, we felt that doing those experiments in that environment would allow for greater controls and then sort of address some of the issues that skeptics raise. So basically, this created the same kind of data that Rupert would usually get in his other kinds of experiments. So it showed that people weren't cheating, essentially, that the levels of results were still essentially the same. Yeah, that was one of the more interesting projects that I organised. I organised the whole event and all of the participants. So we selected people with generally with quite high levels of natural ability, although this particular man in the photograph is actually a journalist. And more recently, I visited IONS, the Institute of Noetic Sciences, and took part in the experiment there, and also had some interesting discussions with Dean Radin and Lauren Carpenter, and I'm waiting to hear from Dean Radin about a potential interesting piece of data, but I can't really talk about that yet until Dean analyzes the data and gets back to me on that. So I wanted to talk a bit about some methodologies and some of sorts of things, how people in the audience might want to sort of approach the out-of-body experience and maybe induce them themselves. So my general approach with teaching and learning to have out-of-body experiences is to move it away from this idea of just focusing on one particular thing, and to move it towards using multiple types of strategies. So, for example, the holistic approach that I described there is using all of the senses, being multi-leveled about how you do things, not just focusing on a technique or a particular belief system or understanding, but looking at it in terms of everything within your life. What are your stress levels? What's your diet like? Are you allowing enough time? Is your job dominating everything that you're doing? So basically looking at every aspect of your life, rather than just thinking, oh, I'll do a technique when I get home that night and I won't pay attention to the wider areas within my life. So it seems to me the reason that some people are successful and some people aren't, but they're doing exactly the same technique, is essentially that they're not looking at the wider area of their own life. So the technique obsession would be basically that some people are very, very obsessed with a particular idea of that there's an ultimate technique, that if they find this ultimate technique that will be in one of the books or one of the courses or whatever, that then they'll be successful. And I think the thing is very important to break that idea and to realize that people can be successful with a very simple technique. Actually, people like me, William Bjorman, many of the authors and OBE experts out there, their initial beginning on this journey started with a very simple technique, but they had this devotion to the process. Maybe they had natural ability, maybe there were other factors in their life in general that influenced it. So I think it's very important to move beyond being focused on the technique and be more focused on maybe finding a technique that's most suitable to you, rather than the ultimate technique. I think it's more that certain techniques are just more suitable to people than others. Then there's the idea of immersion. I like to use, as I mentioned, like goggles. You can see in the picture here, I'm putting on the kind of goggles that create this complete blackout. I also use virtual reality. I also use flotation, immersion, and different things like that. So by using immersion, you create this multi-sensory experience. The immersion might not literally lead to the out-of-body experience in that moment, but it will lead to a sensation that relates to the out-of-body experience, like floating, for example. So if you're in a flotation tank, it's almost like programming your unconscious that you're trying to achieve an out-of-body experience, and that's very, very useful in the process of learning and the process of getting to a full experience. The physical conditioning part is again about dealing with stress, getting enough sleep, making sure that your diet is optimal, that you're not eating right before doing an out-of-body session, so you're falling asleep, or different factors like that, working with your own chronotype, all of those kinds of things. What I call the EDGE method is essentially doing something that has a big enough impact on you emotionally, which is often also a physical thing. Like, for example, when I first induced an out-of-body experience through a lucid dream state, I did a process where I went on a retreat, and I went out into the garden of this retreat center every morning at sunrise, and I sat there as the sun came up, and I spent an hour meditating and doing an affirmation that I would be conscious when I returned to sleep that night. So basically, by doing that, I was able to induce consciousness within the dream state and then go into an out-of-body experience in that way, which I'd never done before. So because of the emotional impact of doing that sun meditation every single morning, of making myself do that, it had a big emotional impact on me, and then it made it far more likely that I would have the consciousness in the dream state and then the out-body experience. So in essence, it's about breaking your comfort zone, getting out of the comfort zone, and doing something that pushes yourself so that you're more likely to remember or to affect your unconscious. DBA is my abbreviation for default body awareness. The final sort of stage of experiencing the out-of-body state, I think, is breaking your sense of where your body is located and your sense of being in the body. So I think one of the ways of doing that is to use is to get to that point of breaking your body awareness by physical techniques like the G technique that I mentioned, the immersion, even deep relaxation, things like that, disorientation, putting yourself in a different position, something along those lines. So there's various different ways of doing that, but it's a very, very complex process in a way to kind of do that, and that's really where I think many people struggle with getting to the out-of-body experience. But I think if you bring in all of those other factors, then it makes breaking that sense of where the self is much easier. Okay, so I wanted to talk about my immersive structures. Going back to 1998, I started working with very basic forms of immersion, if you like, ways to try and create a sense of floating, a sense of being out of the body. And so one of the first that I created was this one called Epicene in 98, which lifted the person off the ground, then used a very early form of my infraliminal sound to try and help the person to the vibrational state, and then it also used hypnosis to try and help go into a deeper state as well. So it was a definite help to a lot of people. It didn't necessarily literally give people an OBE within that moment, but it would in some instances it would give them an out-of-body experience, but in many instances they would go away and then they would have an experience kind of later that evening. I was talking about sensory deprivation. This is the largest type of tank that's available. It's one that we have here in Tallinn. That's I find very useful to get to a very, very deep level of relaxation, and also the sense of floating often leads to me having an out-of-body experience at a later date, and many people I work with report that as well. So another area that I've worked with is virtual reality. So this is a cave structure, which is basically, you can see the kind of three walls that they project onto, and then often the ground as well. This is a setup they've got at University College London, where I did some research for a large-scale project I built and created at the Science Museum in London. You can see how with the floor, in some of the experiences, the floor can disappear, or you can feel like you're on the edge of a ledge and you get that sense of vertigo. And often that then leads to helping to give a sense of floating or being out of body. You can create environments of floating through space, etc. So this is the structure that I designed and built at the Science Museum. It's very hard to show because it was in full stereoscopic 3D, but you can see the curving screen. And then this is kind of one of the images, but you can see it's doubled because it's all in stereoscopic. But basically you would be in this environment with this screen is about 10 meters across, and you would be in that space on your own and able to move around within the virtual environment, and it would give you a sense of something like being in a psychical experience. So it was called the Psychic State of London. So it was essentially a bit like my out-of-body landscape to some degree. So one of my plans for a future project like that, this is the sort of design for a future immersive project that I want to build, that will basically focus on giving people out-of-body experiences, but using the environment to help activate that to the maximum. So all of the aspects of that will be designed for that purpose. So, for example, I've even found that humidity seems to be helpful in some instances. So that structure is designed for humidity, designed that people work well in a small group. So it's designed for 4 people at a time. All of the things that I've found that are helpful for people for inducing OBEs are basically built into the design of that structure. So I wanted to talk, one of the last questions on Bob's list was this idea of the spirituality. I've talked a lot about the veridical, I've talked a lot about the different processes that you can use and the differences between dreams, etc. But I wanted to talk about some of the more subjective and more profound areas. So one of my first out-of-body experiences that gave me a sense of some kind of afterlife or spiritual sort of dimension to all of this was I left my body, and instead of finding myself in what seemed to be a physical environment, I found myself in what seemed to be a very spiritual, mystical type environment. This is about the best image I could get to represent it. It was very misty, very kind of classically afterlife-like. And there was a group of people, more people than depicted in this image, but I was at a distance, somewhat like the distance of the photographer to those people. And I was watching, and they seemed to be distressed. They seemed to be confused and not knowing what had happened to them. And I watched them for a period of time, and then I just found myself sort of moving away from the scene and then drifting back to my body. But then when I watched the news that evening on the TV, I found that there'd been a plane crash that day, and that the people had all been killed in that particular crash in an instantaneous way. I couldn't be certain, but it seemed that the group of people that I'd seen in this particular experience may well have been people in an afterlife type scenario, like who just passed over, essentially. So it was quite an interesting first experience that suggested that kind of thing to me. On a more spiritual, larger consciousness, interconnected consciousness kind of level, I had an experience many years ago that was very much like the painting by Alex Gray. I think he calls this the universal mind lattice. And I basically had an experience where I came out of body and I saw a vast area of energy and expanse that looked very much like this painting. And I slowly, in the experience, drifted into one of the bars of energy that's coming out of this kind of curving fountain. And I drifted into it. And as I connected with it, I felt like I was experiencing the thoughts and minds of millions of people all instantaneously, all at once. So it was very much like a universal mind lattice. So this painting has always had a particular significance to me personally. And then this isn't really related to an out-of-body experience, but just to give a sort of wider context of where all this has led with me. In 2002, I went to Sardinia. This is all described in a lot more detail in my first book, Avenues of the Human Spirit, where I went to Sardinia, and I basically, due to a range of different unfortunate occurrences, I couldn't get access to my bank account, I couldn't get hold of money. So basically I had to live on very little money for the duration of the trip. And during that time I spent the whole time meditating and just focusing on my own spirituality, mainly Zen meditation, which is still what I practice today, Zazen. And I had this shift took place in me, which was very subtle. It wasn't dramatic like some of the out-of-body experiences or the mind lattice experience, but it was a very, very subtle shift that just made me feel like many of the things from my life I had transcended them, and I'd reached a different level in my awareness. So it was a very, very profound experience, and it led me to this sense of kind of ultimate non-duality oneness, really. So I guess that's been the whole journey that I've been on with this, both the science, the out-of-body experiences, the immersion, the technology, but then also the real simplicity and beauty of the spiritual experiences that come from it.
Thank you, Graham, for that intriguing presentation. Let's follow that up with about 20 minutes of Q&A from the audience. Let's have the first question.
Hi, Graham. Great presentation. I really enjoyed it. A question for you I have is, sometimes when I get to the vibrational state, I will see like a three-dimensional area open up and start seeing little stars on the top. Has that ever happened to you? That happens a lot to me. It doesn't really go much farther than that, though. Usually I come out of it.
I can't say I specifically have that, but I think there's a range of different kinds of signs and transitional stages. Like I mentioned about the vibrational state, I think that actually it's lots of different types of phenomena that people describe, and I think what they are representative of some kind of shift taking place, that you're going from your default body awareness that I mentioned to your outer body awareness. So I think it's kind of stages of transition, if you like, and maybe your particular transition, you see that particular structure or the stars. I think it just tends to be a sort of breaking down of one stage to the next.
And how about, you ever hear like a radio station or anything in between those processes, like somebody talking to you? I've heard like radio stations, and I've heard like people telling jokes and stuff like that.
Voices are quite common, not so much in my experience, but a lot of people I work with will describe hearing voices or conversations. Or one woman I was working with sent me an email quite upset because she'd been using my infraliminal sound technology, and she wrote me an email saying, "Oh, the voices on the recording are really annoying to me. You know, I don't like them." And I said, "I think you should listen to it again." And she went back and listened to it again, and then wrote to me and said, "Oh my God, there's no voices on there." It had just been something that had purely happened from the experience, but she was convinced that it was actually on the recording. So I think again, it's the early stages of non-local perception. I think, you know, we start to have sounds and voices and little glimpses, like hypnagogic imagery, that you get in the early stages of sleep and things like that. I think all of these things are little signposts, little signifiers that you're on the right track.
Cool. Thanks, Graham.
You're welcome.
I had a question. I really like your approach, your holistic approach, the idea of ultra relaxation. And I was wondering, as you teach people or teach these techniques, how many people are successful with these techniques? I know you mentioned in the beginning it took you months of practice, 6 months, and how you teach those and how you identify which ones are going to be most effective for different people.
The effective level depends a lot, like teaching anything, on how much the people actually do the work, and you know, whether they actually do the techniques that I teach, etc. I try a lot to actually even to keep people on track and to sort of find ways to sort of do that kind of factor. And I think that's why I think that gives an advantage of why people do quite well sometimes, because they basically look at their life. I encourage people to say, okay, how much stress have you got in your life? How much time commitment have you got in your life? Can you find a way to allow more time to do the OBE practice? Can you incorporate things maybe even in your work day, like taking small breaks, doing small meditations, small affirmations, things like that? So I try to find ways when I work with people to weave the practice within their life structure. But obviously, you know, everyone's different, so you have to find the right methodology in that sense. In terms of selecting the right technique specifically for a person, well, first I look at their chronotype, whether they're morning people, nighttime people, whether they have ability with lucid dreaming, whether they're more waking trance type people like I am, like mediums and remote viewers, people who are more conscious in their psychic ability. Those types of people I'll give more like waking approaches. The lucid dream people I'll give more dreaming approaches. What tends to be the case is people who are more morning people tend to be paired with people who are more lucid dreamers. So for some reason, lucid dreamers seem to be morning people, and the remote viewers, the people who are skilled in waking consciousness, those people tend to be more the nocturnal types. That's just from doing the work, what I've observed over years. It doesn't apply to everyone. Some people don't conform to that, but that's the common structure. And then I also will look at what their skills are. If they're more musical, artistic, physical, what kind of person are they? What do they do in their life? What are their hobbies? That kind of thing. And then you can select a technique that works well with the type of person they are. If they're more visual and artistic, then maybe a visualization technique. If they're more physical and athletic, then maybe the G technique that I mentioned, a more physical technique. If they're more musical, maybe focus on the infraliminal sound or using sound and things like that. So it depends. What you often find is someone who's not a very good visualizer will be trying to do a visualization technique, or someone who's not very good with sound using sound technologies and things like that. So it can become, they can be using the wrong technique for them, basically. That's very common. So I try to, look at their whole life, look at the particular technique that will work for them individually, and also find strategies for weaving it into their day-to-day life.
So how many people have you worked with in this way, and how much success have you had, and how long does it take generally?
I've been working with people in that way since I was 15 years old. I worked for a teacher when I was 15 who was already teaching out-of-body experiences. So I don't know how many exactly, hundreds. And success rate, the people who actually do the work, I'd say maybe 70%, something like that.
So what percentage do the work? That's, I think, the challenge, right? To get people to be engaged. Because people fantasize about this type of experience, but they don't necessarily put.
But that's also why I developed an approach of using coaching, so that I can work with someone in a very in-depth way. So again, if you do a workshop, a person's got a limited amount of time that they can engage with me, that they can get feedback, that they can get support. So I moved towards doing coaching, because that way I can engage with them more over a longer period of time, and I can make it more likely that they'll have some level of success with the process. And the same with the courses. By doing a course over a period of weeks, I can work with them, I can give them feedback, I can tell them what they're doing wrong. So, there's no one out there who can guarantee someone an experience. But what we can do is create the best possible chances by structuring the course in the best way. And I think I've done that as much as I could possibly do. So.
Super. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, Graham. Thanks a lot. You were talking about the weightlessness machine that you'd built, the first one. And then you also said something about hypnotism at the same time and how you use both. So could you talk a little bit about the hypnotic part of that?
Sure. Well, I think part of my approach as well was there's no reason to just focus on one thing. If we know that if we can create something that's multisensory, I think it's more likely to have an unconscious impact and a conscious impact as well. I think you get a much bigger impact when you use all of those elements. So with that structure, it lifted the person off the ground, so it had a physical dimension to it. Then it had the audio track, an early form of it, not as advanced as the one I use now, but an early form of it that helped to guide the person towards the vibrational state. And then I used hypnosis to suggest the idea of leaving the body, of feeling wakeness, and also to deal with things like fears, because often people do have certain fears about the experience. So hypnosis is a good way of addressing fears, creating more relaxation in the person, and allowing them to feel more comfortable with the process. So it was sort of like a guided meditation. It wasn't really in-depth hypnosis, just enough to sort of help the person to relax more and to go with the process.
Well, thank you. And the frequency you're talking about, is there a hertz to that? What is the frequency that you're going for?
It's not a frequency. It's a pattern of frequencies. It's based on. It started with research to do with infrasound, and then you probably know about the 7 hertz thing. There's 7 hertz is quite key with a lot of different associations, and also 4 hertz was quite key with Robert Monroe's observations, and I found that somewhere between 4 and 7 hertz was related to my own brain frequency state as well. So, but what I did was over a period of a few years, we looked at ways to create a pattern that would attune to the same kind of brain pattern that I was having when I was in the vibrational state. So it's a combination. It's a sort of structure of frequencies, not just one frequency. So it's the name comes from infra, meaning like very low level sound, infrasound, and liminal, meaning being in that in between state, so between sort of conscious and unconscious. So those are it's the idea of affecting the state of awareness through very low level frequencies.
Okay, and one more question. Could you talk more about the consciousness that you were alluding to with the tubular, microtubulars in the brain, and how that relates to overall consciousness, and then the collective consciousness, and then the personal consciousness for that?
Well, I'm not a physicist, but the idea comes from Sir Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff. They have a theory called, ORC-OR, they say, which is short for orchestrated reduction. So they basically have this idea that the microtubules, which are very, very low structures in cells throughout the body, not just in the brain, are, I think the general gist of his theory, I'm probably doing a total disservice to him, but the basic idea is that those very low-level structures are entangled in some way, so they have these non-local properties, and he feels that consciousness arises via these quantum effects rather than via purely processes within the brain. But then Hameroff also applies this more into the realms of the near-death experience, because if consciousness is entangled, what we know about the quantum level is that things can essentially be in like 2 places at the same time, or affecting each other instantaneously across any distance and things like that. So it would imply that possibly consciousness could be duplicated, or that it could be extended out beyond the brain. So I think the general idea with a lot of these theories, Brian Josephson's theory as well, who's a Nobel laureate in physics, and also Henry Stapp, and quite a lot of physicists have this idea that maybe consciousness could be extended through this sort of quantum biology. But I'm not an expert in the physics, so there's people who could explain that better than I could.
Thank you.
Hello, Graham. Thanks for staying up with us. I had kind of a couple questions. I just finished reading Thomas Campbell's My Big Toe Theory of Everything, and he mentions a pretty wide range of consciousness, much greater than we have in the physical world, once you're out of your body. And I was wondering if you'd ever communed with or communicated with any kind of higher, larger consciousness, or maybe encountered consciousnesses that were not necessarily human. Any experience with that?
I think so, but I guess I'm always a bit reluctant to say for sure, because I think it's very subjective and it's very hard to know how genuinely real those things are and not a part of your own unconscious, if you like. So I always have a certain degree of reservation about what they are, but yeah, I have encountered various sort of other levels of consciousness, if you like, that seem to be possibly non-human or something like guides or whatever. Never anything alien, if that's what you're getting at, but definitely non-human of some form. But again, I don't know objectively how to frame that. But I talk more about that in my first book, Avenues of the Human Spirit. It's more about the sort of journey I've been on and the experiences I've had, and it goes beyond the out-of-body experience into sort of other types of experiences as well.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if you were familiar with something called the Oversoul, just a kind of a next higher incarnation, I guess, of ourselves, or maybe something that manages multiple consciousnesses. It's just one of his observations when he's been out of body. I
think me and Tom Campbell have a very similar outlook. He may be he's maybe structured it into more of I think I'm still holding a lot more question marks over what I think's going on, and I'm coming at it from a slightly different angle, because I think I'm coming at it from the veridical and the parapsychological and the sort of research very much rooted in the experience, very directly, whereas I think Tom's bringing in more of his expertise from physics. Mm-hmm. So I think we're kind of coming from different ends and sort of meeting in the middle a bit. But yeah, I think Anthony Peake as well is someone I have a lot of respect for, who's quite similar in his outlooks. And Anthony's very open to sort of new research and to changing his mind and all of that kind of thing. So I think there's a lot of really interesting people out there.
Okay. Can I ask one more question? Okay, I got one more quick one. During my adolescence, I had a whole lot of intense lucid dreams, and a lot of them, there was a recurring one that's been, it's less frequent now, but it had to do with telekinesis, and it was to the point where I was so familiar with this telekinetic ability within the lucid dream that I was completely familiar with it. I just sunk back into it like it was second nature. Have you encountered anything like that, or it just felt, I don't know if I was just so in love with that, having that power, but it was definitely a lucid dream because it was, completely vivid.
What do you mean? What do you mean? Have I experienced telekinesis, or?
Well, in the dream, I was experiencing telekinesis. Like, I could move objects. I could even gauge how much something would weigh, like at a distance, and I could judge distance, and it was just very specific. And the older I get, the less I have them. But I didn't know if anyone else if you'd ever heard of that, or if.
Well, I've done all sorts of things in lucid dreams in terms of moving things with my mind and stuff like that. But I'm not a particularly gifted lucid dreamer. That's I see it as a different sort of skill set, really, with to the OBE. Like I said, my OBEs happen from a conscious state, so I I do occasionally induce them from a dream state, but it's more of an effort to do that for me. It's more complicated, whereas doing it from a waking state is very fluid and natural for me.
Okay, I appreciate your presentation. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, I guess that'll kind of wrap it up here. I do have a question. It might be personal. What took you to Estonia?
I came here while traveling, and I just kind of fell in love with the place. And there's a very strong spiritual, communities here. I came here for 2 months to do some. You saw probably in the picture that I showed of Tallinn. It's a very picturesque place. So I thought it'd be a good place to finish my first book. So I came here with the intention of being here for 2 months to write the first book, the end of the first book, and that was 5 years ago. So.
Okay, well, very good. We really appreciate it.
My partner is Estonian, so.
Okay, that makes a difference too. Thank you very much.